Okay, good evening, angry birds and bad piggies. My name's Danny Whitaker. This is My Own Worst Enemy, mental health podcast. Here we go again. Right, for those of you that have been sort of listening for any length of time, you might remember that the sort of intro portion of the podcast used to be sort of a nice, polite, well-rehearsed little musing about the topic at hand. And then somewhere down the line, they sort of turned into, well, basically like my weekly therapy session where I sort of moan about whatever's been winding me up in the past week. Well, I suppose, for the first time ever, these inane ramblings of mine are going to be quite opposite this week because we're talking about stress. So, but before we get to that, of course, I have to dole out one of these inane ramblings. So, I think I've mentioned before, we've been like doing work on the house for the past, 2, 3, maybe 4 months or something like that. And we're basically just ripping everything out, ripping the wallpaper, the carpets, just everything. And the whole house nearly completely refurbishing. So there was loads of crap lying around, loads of stuff to get rid of. And yeah, when you like hire a skip or whatever, you only get it for like 2 or 3 weeks. Like I say, we've been at this for months now and we knew we were going to be. So we thought instead of hiring a skip or hiring multiple skips and just keep paying for them and sort of half filling them, we'll just chuck all the crap in the back garden in a nice big pile. And then when we're done, we'll hire a skip, chuck it all in there, get rid of it in one go, save a bit of money. Well, guess what? Next door neighbours only went and reported us to the council, said it looks unsightly, right? So we got a little note through the door. The inspectors came round, stuck a note through the door saying, get it all cleaned up in a week or you're going to get a fine. Which, to be fair, it did look unsightly, but I didn't know it was bothering anybody, you know? So I just kind of thought it was, very unneighbourly, if that's a word. I thought they could, just knock on the door and say, when are you going to get rid of your crap? It's not the best, we don't like it. And I'd have got rid of it. But, so anyway, I confronted the husband. He was out on his driveway one morning, went over and said, what's going on? Why didn't you just come and speak to me? Well, he got straight to blaming his wife. Right? I'm thinking, cowardly deflection. But then he, it's like it opened the emotional floodgates. He starts going on about how he's sick of her and she's an embarrassment and he wished he'd gotten rid of her ages ago. And then he called her the C word. Right? Now, round here, we throw the C word around like it's a term of endearment, right? Like my best mate's mum back in the day when we were teenagers, she used to call us all little C's, right? It's just what we do round here. But even round here, you don't call your missus one. Jesus. So, yeah, I don't know, maybe it was her. But anyway, so Leanne's been chomping at the bit now for revenge. He's sort of started a neighbours war now. And I suggested we just sort of sit back and watch their marriage implode. But yeah, Leanne wants to sort of strike back in some sort of official capacity. So, they've got a couple of dogs that are always howling like wolves whenever they get left at home on their own. So, that's noise pollution. And they've got one of these sort of pothead sons who's one of these that sort of smoked all his brain cells away so that, like, every sentence he, like, says has, like, 50 likes in it and, like, takes him, like, half an hour to, like, get to the end of it. One of those. Well, he comes round to visit him every couple of weeks, and he's always outside on the patio smoking weed and stinking the place up. It's so bad. We have to kind of you have to close the windows in the house, otherwise the smell gets in, and then the whole place smells like a drug den for a couple of hours. But up to now, it's been very sort of live and let live. But not anymore. The battle of the angry wives is about to commence. So I'll be sure to let you know of any developments in that department. Something more positive, though, this past week. So a couple more people have been nice enough to sponsor the show. So I'm slowly creeping towards my goal of buying some decent camera equipment so I can start doing some like proper video content for YouTube. Thank you to Brian from Scotland, especially. I was absolutely floored by your donation. So yeah, that one's going towards a decent webcam. So, yeah, thank you again for that. And I've said before, I do promise to produce some exclusive content for people who subscribe or donate. But in the meantime, for those of you who like a more immediate reward for helping out, I've cobbled together a way for people to sponsor the podcast and get something in return. So basically, I've designed a bunch of t-shirts based on the new logo. You might have noticed I've sort of updated the logo recently. So basically, the t-shirts that are designed to sort of match whatever mood you're in on a particular day. You know, so whether you're feeling moody, tired, needy, wanting a bit of attention, whatever, sort of like a t-shirt for every mood. So they're basically just different versions of the Maui logo, kind of like different emojis, I suppose, with a little bit of text on there. And I've called it Moody Gear for sad days and bad days. That's the slogan. There's about 6 designs up there so far, but I will be putting some more together. They're £14 each, and I get about £3-4 of that because the rest goes on manufacturing. And but yeah, I just thought it'd be a nice way of you guys getting something in return for sponsoring the show while I work on coming up with some exclusive content. So yeah, if you'd like to support the show, make a donation, grab a t-shirt, whatever, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support. So yeah, anyway, as I said, today's episode, we're discussing the topic of stress. My guest today is Professor Carmine Pariante. Carmine is Professor of Biological Psychiatry at King's College London, where he also leads the Stress, Psychiatry and Immunology Lab, investigating the relationship between stress, mental health and the immune system. Carmine is the editor of a number of books, including Understanding Depression, a Translational Approach, and Behavioural Neurobiology of Stress-Related Disorders, and he also writes a blog for the Huffington Post. He has received a number of awards for his research, including the 2012 Academic Psychiatrist of the Year Award from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the 2015 Anna Monica Prize for research on depression, and the Norman Cousins Award for outstanding contributions to research in psychoneuroimmunology. Got that in one. Well done. In today's episode, we discuss the biology of stress, everything from the anatomy of the brain to the endocrine system, and how it all functions together as a whole. We explore the evolutionary advantages of the stress response, how the pressures of modern life can cause stress to become chronic, and how the physiological damage of long-term stress can lead to conditions such as anxiety and depression. Now, before we jump in, I'd say the first third of the interview is quite technical. A lot of long words and anatomical descriptions and hormones and bits of the brain and all sorts, but stick with it because, well, the reason I wanted to explore this technical side is because it seems that a lot of clinical psychologists seem to eschew the biology and neurology of mental health. And the reason for this seems to be that the general consensus is that the sort of like knowledge of the biological aspects of mental health disorders aren't very helpful in clinical practice. And yeah, I don't know, maybe it's me, but I totally disagree with this. I think this kind of Cartesian duality where we focus purely on the cognitive aspects of mental health and negating the role that biology plays sort of only serves to sort of shore up this idea of things like anxiety and depression as being these sort of like poltergeists of the mind that we've become possessed by. And I think, yeah, sort of grounding some of these experiences in biology, for me anyway, it's explanatory in a way that's sort of far superior to just a psychiatric diagnosis alone. So yeah, like I say, stick with it because it's well worth it, I think. Anyway, as always, you can comment on this episode by going to myownworstenemy.org. And as I always say, please enjoy my conversation with Professor Carmine Pariante. Carmine Pariante, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Right. The question we're interested in answering today is how stress affects the brain. But, as always, just so everybody knows I haven't roped in some dodgy pseudoscience-y self-help guru, I always ask my guests to tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and why you do it as well, please.
So, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm Italian, but I've been working at King's College London and at the Maudsley Hospital for more than 20 years. And I'm a clinical academic, so most of the time is spent at the university doing research or teaching, I'm also a consultant psychiatrist, and I see, in particular, I do a clinic for women with mental health problems in pregnancy or the perinatal period in general.
And why psychiatry? Why choose that as your field of expertise?
I've always been fascinated by how the mind works, how emotions and thoughts and behavior all interact together, both kind of normal behavior and difficult behavior, and mental health and mental health problems. So it's always been probably the area that I've been most interested in general, even when I was a medical student.
So on your KCL profile, your title is biological psychiatrist. Could you explain exactly what that is? Because it seems the convergence of two separate fields. So if you could tell us a little bit more about exactly what biological psychiatry is.
So biological psychiatry is that branch, if you like, of psychiatry in general that looks how changes in the brain and also in changes in the body underpin the mental health difficulties that then we describe overall with our clinical terms of mental disorders. And it obviously is not in an antithesis with psychological model or psychosocial models. We know very well that basically mental health problems derives from a combination of environmental effect on a kind of biological predisposition. Ultimately, whatever happens to you in life has an effect on your brain, and whatever emotions and thoughts and behavior that you have is driven by your brain. So it's try to understand what aspect of the brain and, as I said, also the body underpin mental health activity in general, but mental health problems in particular.
Right, okay. So, I've got to be honest, my knowledge of mental health sort of ends below the neck. After that, I haven't got a clue. So, even I'm not sure exactly where this interview's going to go today. I've done my best to prepare for it, but we're bringing in all kinds of long words and parts of the body that I've got absolutely no familiarity with. So I think a good place to start with would be, okay, so for me, it seems that the idea of how stress affects the brain is maybe a three-step process. So we've got an exterior stressor, which then elicits a physiological response from the brain. The brain sends a signal to the body, elicits a physiological response. And then the third step being that this physiological response, if it becomes chronic, then can then affect the body. So I think what we'll do is kind of start with that 3 steps and go through them one at a time. So the first one to deal with is what is the definition of a stressor from a biopsychiatric perspective?
So stress is considered any situation where we feel that the demands that are going to be put on ourselves are potentially higher or stronger than our capability to respond. So we feel under threat that we may not be able to react to the challenge in front of us. It could be obviously an emotional challenge. So if we're faced by a really sad news or a really anxiety-provoking situation, or it could be a real physical threat, as when we are in a situation of violence and risk for ourselves. Obviously, from a biological point of view, stress response is originated in the animal kingdom, and we have kind of used it for hundreds of millions of years as men in a cave, largely to protect us from predators and kind of life-threatening situation. But now we have extended this concept also in a kind of more, if you like, cultural way, also in terms of facing situations that, although they're not life-threatening, they threat our self-esteem, our emotional integrity, and our ability to cope with the situation. So from a biological point of view, everything starts in the brain, in terms of the brain has the ability to very rapidly make an assessment of a situation, and if it's interpreted as stressful, as in threatening, then a specific area of the brain gets activated. Now, again, the pattern is slightly different if you all of a sudden a lion jump in front of you versus if you are going to sit in front of an audience to give a talk. But it's largely quantitative changes rather than qualitative. And the key area of the brain that get activated really quickly are the amygdala and the hippocampus. These are two areas that kind of sits at the bottom of our brain, and they receive information from the more cognitive area of the brain, like the cortex, where obviously is the place where the information coming from the outside is first elaborated.
Right, okay, so let's unpack those a little bit. So what would be a kind of basic description of what the cortex does, the role of the cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus? If you could give us a basic introduction to those three parts of the brain.
So the cortex, which is, as the name says, is actually the most external layers of our brain, is where most of the more advanced functions of the brain are present. So the reasoning, the moving, the feeling in terms of somatic sensation, the language, the hearing, the seeing, is where, basically most of the things that we consider associated with human, or also animal, kind of more sophisticated brain activity takes place. So the cortex is where we integrate the information that comes from the eyes, that shows us the dangers, or the hearing that gives us the noise of the dangers, or the smell, which is more important in animals than in humans, but still is very important once we receive signal like smokes or other dangerous signals. So all the information kind of get together and a decision is made that we are facing a challenge. That decision is then communicated to more, if you like, primordial area of the brain, which are in particular the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is also where memory is stored, or large part of the memory is stored. And these are the vehicles that then communicate, they're basically the station that triggers this dangerous signal down to the body. And they communicate with the rest of the body to prepare for what we call the fight or flight response, which is basically preparing the body to face the challenge in front of us by either fighting the challenge or running away from it. And remember, this is still a biological response largely based on the notion of predators. It's about facing an acute life-threatening situation from which we basically have only two alternatives. We either fight and win, or fight and die, or we run away. And we can talk later about how does that is changed when obviously most of the stressor for us, they're no longer acute and life-threatening, but they're chronic and threatening our quality of life rather than our life.
Yeah, I would like to kind of, I think a good way of just describing the basic biology is to kind of stick to the idea of an immediate stressor, and then we'll elaborate on that becoming chronic a bit later on. So is there let's stick with the lion analogy So the lion jumps out, or the lion. Let's imagine we see the lion in the distance, because I'm imagining already that there's a difference between a panic response and an anxiety response. So I'm guessing that if the lion jumps out at you, it's going to elicit a panic response. Whereas if you see the lion in the distance as a possible threat, that elicits an anxiety response.
Yes, but it's largely a quantitative difference rather than a qualitative.
Right.
I mean, of course, if the lion is so distant that it really poses no threat at all, then it just, it gives a indication of the environment, information that we need to take into consideration, or whether, for example, we need to change direction or not. However, if the lion is close enough that we are aware that, the lion may run against us, then we get alarmed, and that level of alarm is just, as I said, proportional to the dangers, but it's just a quantitative proportion rather than a qualitative. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just wondering about one thing that sort of appeared to me then is the idea of maybe proximity to a stressor or a danger. Is that decision about proximity to danger, is that something we do? So is it Cortex based? It's an analysis of the situation and deciding whether or not the proximity of an immediate threat is something we need to worry about or not? Or is proximity something that's maybe decided automatically and unconsciously?
It's a combination of both.
Right.
Obviously, if people are used to a specific stressful situation, if you are a hunter that looks for a lion, you will react very differently compared to someone that is put in a situation of risk totally unexpectedly and with no preparation. So preparation makes a big difference. It's the same things about, if you have to jump with a parachute, you feel differently if you've trained and tried in a safe environment before going for it, rather than if you're just, put on a plane and thrown out of an airplane with no preparation at all. So it's a combination of it. The closer the danger becomes, the more everybody gets stressed.
Yep.
What's the threshold is an individual level, and it is about, obviously, personality. Is about whether that specific threat is perceived as particularly dangerous. Obviously, people with phobias have specific anxiety about individual situations, which for another person may not be threatening at all. The classic fears of elevators or height. For someone who doesn't have it, it's almost impossible to understand. While for someone that is suffer from fear of height, even getting a meter's closer from a parapet could be too close. So that's that combination. Your individual response is always a combination of the objective severity of the stress and your perception and your preparation for it. But as a rule, the closer and the more intense the stress is, the more of us will react in the same way. Right.
Another one, just before we kind of move on to below the neck, is I'm interested in kind of clarifying the interaction between the amygdala and the cortex. So, because my understanding of it has always been, and I can't remember where I read this, but it's the idea that when we say you walk into your bedroom at night and you open the door and you see an axe murderer there. Sorry, you before you even realise anything's happened, you open the door and you jump in fear before you even analyse the situation, because it appeared that there was somebody in the room, but you switch the light on, and then it was just kind of the dressing gown hanging over the mirror or whatever. So it's this idea that the amygdala knows what's going on and assesses the situation before you even get involved.
So that's the beauty of our life-saving stress response, that it recognizes the danger even before we consciously recognize it. And the principle is that it's much better to be alarmed and then realize that actually is a mistake than being in a dangerous situation and not recognizing it immediately. So the system is predisposed so that panic kicks in every time it's needed, plus a lot of other times it is not needed, because it's much better to be in panic and have your life saved by the panic rather than risking on one occasion not recognize the danger. Again, you need to interpret this always based on the predator risk, not of the psychosocial stress or work environment or emotional stress. So that's the mechanism. Now, so the amygdala reacts acutely to every perception of, very, very rapid perception, usually from noise or from sight or from smell, that something is wrong. Then the cortex elaborates on that and can suppress it if needed, or can just let it go. But this is a second stage.
Yes. Yeah, I'm imagining that so the caveman that saw the lion's eyes in the swaying grass and immediately panicked and ran away, he's obviously the one that survived, whereas the other caveman that stood there going, maybe it's not a lion, maybe it's just a cute little kitty cat, he's the one that ended up dead because his cortex was doing most of the work, and with the other guy, the amygdala kicked in first, and so that's why it works the way it does today.
Yes. I mean, of course, the price that you pay is that you run away a lot of the time that there is no lion. So you run away, and then you stop, you look back, and you realize it wasn't a lion.
Yeah.
But the one time that actually there is a lion, that's when it's worth it. And so that's why this mechanism is being protected and maintained in nature.
Right. So what exactly does the hippocampus do then? Because it seems like, well, the amygdala helps us recognize a threat and react to it immediately, and then the cortex kind of analyzes the situation. So what's the hippocampus doing?
So the amygdala communicates to the hippocampus to activate the stress response in the body.
Right.
Well, the amygdala does some of it on its own, and some of it through the hippocampus. Basically, is the signal goes down to the bottom of the brain, and two things happen in parallel. One is the activation of what we call the sympathetic nervous system. So this is basically a series of nerves that originate from the brain and then reach all our organs like the heart, the muscles, our gastrointestinal systems, the skin, and these are the signal that gives the most immediate reaction to stress, or to in a situation, for example, of danger, or a situation in which you're scared or anxious. So, for example, the tachycardia, the inability to breathe, the sweating. These are direct consequences of the increased sympathetic activity, which is driven by the brain and is exerted to these nerves that goes and interact with every aspect of our body. The pain in our stomach, sometimes the discomfort in our tummy or in our intestines, and other things happen that prepares you for a real fight. So the muscles in your the veins in your muscles increase, so you get more blood flow to your muscles, so you're ready to either run or fight. Your pupils dilate, so they become bigger, so more you can get more light into your eyes and you can see better, again, so you have more peripheral vision and you're more able to, again, run or fight. So all of these changes are kind of preparing you in the immediate response. We're talking about seconds to minutes in which all of these changes happen. And this is the first stage, the very immediate stage of the stress response. Is what we is is what explains the feeling that we have of our heart sinking suddenly if we are scared.
Right.
Then, in parallel to this, a second system starts to kick in, which is called the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Axis, or which is the stress hormonal system. So rather than being, this second phase is not mediated by direct nerve-to-nerve contact from the brain to the peripheral organs, but rather from substances that are released in the bloodstream and reach our body through the bloodstream. And the key substance for this stress response is cortisol, which many of us more or less have heard as the stress hormone.
Yeah.
So it's a cascade of events. The amygdala signal the hippocampus signal the hypothalamus, which is right below. The hypothalamus signals to the pituitary gland, which is basically still is outside the brain, but is attached to the brain. So it's basically right at the bottom of the brain. And then the pituitary gland release hormones that go into the circulation. They go into the main blood, and they reach the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland is a very small organ, just a few centimeters, that sits on top of our kidneys on both left and right. And the adrenal gland is the whole organs that produce cortisol, and which is then released into the circulation. So to do this, it takes a few minutes. It's still quite rapid, but you really don't see an increase in cortisol level until at least 8 to 10 minutes after the beginning of the stress. And it kind of peaks around 20 to 30 minutes after the beginning of the stress. Again, it depends how dramatic and life-threatening the stress is, but it's certainly not as quick as what we described before, the sympathetic nervous system response.
Right. So I've got a few questions have arisen there for me. So I guess the first one is, so this hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, is there a simplistic way of explaining what the hypothalamus is, what it does, and what the pituitary gland is and what it does?
Yep. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It sits kind of in the lower part of the brain and is where all the neurons, all the brain cells that are responsible for body function are located.
Okay. So
the hypothalamus has brain cells that regulate sleep, appetite and food intake, sexual behavior. So all the main function, if you like, all the main behaviors that are mediated through our body. So, for example, maternal behavior, the behavior that is activated in situation in which of caring for a newborn, they're all driven by brain cells localized in the hypothalamus. It's truly the station where the brain and the body get in contact.
Right.
But we're still inside the brain, and there's still basically brain cells that give this. They communicate to the body and give orders at the different compartments of the body. And one of these group of brain cells regulate the stress response. So they communicate to another organ, which is the apophysis, which is outside the brain and is really a small endocrine organ. So it's basically cells that produce hormones that go into the blood. It is outside the brain. It is physically outside the brain, but it's attached to it. So it's if you want to picture it, is almost kind of below our nose. If you go deep inside, it's behind our nose. If you look at us, you can probably our hypothesis would be more or less behind our nose, halfway in our head, right below the brain.
Well, just for people listening, I will include in the show notes some diagrams to kind of have a look at as we're going along with this anyway. So,
and so the hypophysis is, if you like, the next step in the communication between the brain and the body. That's where the signal that originates from the hypothalamus are transformed from local signal, so brain-related, if you like, signal, into signal that goes to the rest of the body. And it's done because the hypophysis secretes substances, which we call hormones, that goes into the blood. So it goes into the circulation and therefore can reach all the compartments of the body. So the hypophysis secretes hormone like prolactin, which goes to the breast to regulate breastfeeding, but also in general participate to things like emotional behavior and caring behavior and sexual behavior. So the hypophysis secretes hormones that reach other stations in the body. Prolactins reach the breast, the estrogens or progesterone stimulating hormones reach the ovaries or the testicles, and there's another hormone which specifically stimulates cortisol, which goes to the adrenal gland. So imagine as a relay or a system organization. The brain gives a signal to the hypothalamus. Obviously, that's very local. The hypothalamus gives a signal to the hypophysis. It's quite close, but it's going outside the brain. The hypophysis gives a signal to other stations which are in the body, and they are still hormonal stations, so they don't do anything except produce more substances, and these are ovary, thyroid, testicles, adrenal gland, and then these final stations produce the hormones that then goes into the circulation and reach our target tissues, muscles, heart, stomach, and so on, liver. I hope it's clear. I know it's complicated.
Yes, but this is, so all this that's taking place and a shifting of blood to away from the organs to the muscles, this is getting us prepared for that fight or flight response.
So the mechanism that I've described, so the relationship between the hypothalamus with the hypophysis and the hypophysis with the other endocrine organs and the other endocrine organs to the rest of the body, is a general mechanism that operates every day. So to regulate, as I said, sleep, feeding behavior, menstrual cycle, sexual behavior, caring behavior. These mechanisms, so this communication, these relay stations between the brain and the body always operates always. As part of this, there is also, if you like, one train line that specifically operates the stress reaction. Okay.
Right. Another one that I've not heard mentioned, although we've mentioned the release of cortisol, but another one that another hormone that gets mentioned quite a lot with the idea of stress is adrenaline.
Yes.
Where does adrenaline come in?
So adrenaline is kind of halfway through between the sympathetic nervous systems and the cortisol, so the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Axis release. So it's really part of the sympathetic nervous system. As you will remember, I've said that the sympathetic nervous system is largely driven by direct nerve communication between the brain and the target organ. So there are literally nerves, one after each other, connecting to muscles, stomachs, heart, lungs, and so on. And one of these nerves also communicate directly with the adrenal gland, although to a different area of the adrenal gland, which produce adrenaline, which is the same hormones or very similar hormones that is released in the nerve's termination as part of the sympathetic nervous system. So it's basically the same substance that is released at the nerve level is also, there's a kind of a floating of it through the blood. If you like, it's almost like a backup, so that on top, the communication through the nerves happens in milliseconds. The communication, and then there is like a second wave of danger signal coming from the adrenaline releasing to the blood, which probably takes, a few seconds. And then there is the cortisol that comes in as a third wave in a few minutes.
Right. Okay. So I don't know if I'm misunderstanding this. So is adrenaline more associated with immediate threat and cortisol associated with prolonged sense of threat?
Well, definitely adrenaline is associated with the immediate response to threat.
Yep.
The response, once it's activated, kicks in anyway. So, if give you an example, if you have, if I show you something really stressful for 3 minutes, your sympathetic nervous system gets activated, your adrenaline gets activated. Then at that point, if I stop the stress, you're no longer stressed because I removed the stressful situation. Your cortisol level will continue to go up anyway. So the reaction kicks in, it will continue. Obviously, it will be short-lived and will just peak, and then after 20 minutes or so, we'll go back to normal. But you will still have a reaction. It has a latency. It's almost like a big bus, even more so. It's a big ship that once starts moving, it takes time to stop anyway. But it is so stress always activates all of this mechanism. But the adrenaline and the sympathetic nervous systems are the one that gives you the immediate startle response. I mean, literally, it gives you, is the spark that allows you to run away, to put those 50, 100 meters between you and the lion, or to literally fight for your life against the lion, while the cortisol comes in, in a few minutes to give you the energy to sustain the fight. If after 5 minutes you have not run away, or if you still need to run, then you will need additional level of energy. Adrenaline in the sympathetic nervous system gives you the energy for a very intense, rapid, almost violent response, not aggressive in per se, but violent as in sudden, strong, immediate. But it doesn't give you enough energy to sustain that effort for a long time. If you do have to sustain the effort, cortisol, that's what cortisol comes in and gives you the additional energy for 20 minutes, half an hour.
Right. That's nailed it for me. I get it. Okay. So one thing I'm interested in is, so this idea of a fight or flight or freeze is sometimes included in that response. How do we choose which one to do? Is that based on personality, whether we'll choose to fight or flee in a situation? What's the mechanism that decides which one of those three we choose?
It's a very interesting question, and again, it's a combination of factors. One is certainly personality. The second one is preparation and exposure. So, if you're a soldier and you have been in a battlefield before, you probably have a personality that drives you toward a situation where you feel comfortable in engaging into a combat situation. But also you've learned how to engage in a combat situation. You feel some level of empowerment and control over the situation because you at least have the skills knowing what to do. Same for firefighters. Yes, probably you need some personality traits that makes you feel brave and confident and perhaps altruistic enough to want to dedicate your time to this activity, but you also you get trained on how to fight the fire. And so when you are in front of a fire, you feel more confident that you can control the situation. If you are completely unprepared in a situation where you've never been before, you're more likely to either freeze or run away. Having said that, a lot of it is driven by a lot of people have reaction that they would never thought, So we know of people that would run into a fire to save their children, for example, or sometimes really altruistic people that would run into a fire or would engage into a fight even to save strangers. So that's where the individual element comes in, and it's very difficult to predict. We know when there was the London Bridge attack, there were actually people. Most people run away or try to save their life, rightly so, and that's what that's the normal reaction. A few people actually went toward the dangers to try to stop it. So and there was a policeman, so perhaps that person felt also he had some training, but there were also people that only did it out of good heart. Is that, unpredictability, or how would you respond in that situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's probably an episode all of its own, that one.
Yeah.
So sticking with this concrete example of the lion on the savannah. Well, let's be honest. If you freeze, you're going to get eaten, and maybe not, because I suppose the idea with freezing is that you might not be spotted by the predator. But let's face it, you're not fighting a lion and winning. So let's imagine that our person in this hypothetical situation has ran away from the lion. So what was it? The adrenaline kicks in, which sends him legging it. And then, I don't know, maybe he turns around and sees the lion trotting behind him because it might fancy having a go. And that's where the cortisol kicks in, because he's got to run that little bit longer to keep going. And let's imagine that he scuppers up a cliff face and he manages to escape the lion. What happens next?
Well, once you've removed yourself from the stressful situation, everything returns to normal. And usually quickly, within, half an hour or so. Now, again, a few million years ago, probably most of us would meet predators quite frequently. Now it's quite rare. So if any of us is if you're involved in a situation that your life is at risk, a terrorist attack or a fight with a violent person, or, a sexual violence attack, then this stays with you. You will be physically remain quite scared and alerted for many, many hours, and then there may be even longer consequences. But the initial stress response at the body level does normalize, is predisposed to normalize.
And so this is so with the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which directs blood flow to the muscles and etc., so we can run away. This is the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Is that correct?
But the parasympathetic nervous system kind of kicks in to compensate and to try and to alleviate this arousal and that is driven by the sympathetic. So it's a little bit like a yin and yang.
Yeah. I think the summary I've heard is if the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response, then the parasympathetic is the rest and digest. So after with the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, we can calm down, blood flow can go back towards the digestive system, and but again, I don't know what I'm talking about, so I'd like confirmation whether that's the case.
Yes, it is the case. I mean, certainly, the heart cannot sustain the frequency of beat that you will have when you're running away from a lion. It will just simply fail at some point. So that's when, especially once the stress is removed, so you're actually feeling safe, that's why you quickly need another biological system that brings everything back to normal. And that's the same for all the other components of the body. It's like running a car at the top speed. It can do it, but not for long. Otherwise, the engine will break. And we're not supposed to do it for long because, as we've said, probably in 10 or 20 minutes, either we have run away enough that the lion has stopped chasing us, or we fight and won, or we're dead.
Right. So with this immediate stress response, immediate short-term stress response, perfectly fine, perfectly natural, it's not going to do anybody any harm. Apparently, it's when stress becomes prolonged, chronic, extended, that stress response can start to do damage to the brain and the body. Now, if we was going to include all the bodily damage that it can do, it'd be a 5-hour episode. So we're just going to stick to the effects that it has on the brain and the links that stress has to depression and possibly anxiety. So I guess the place to get started with this might be, in what kinds of situations are we talking about where this stress response becomes chronic, where it doesn't switch off?
Every situation that we perceive as a challenge. So poverty, unemployment, which brings both, a lack of self-worth and also some, the difficult life that it brings, a work environment in which we feel under pressure and that we don't manage, a pressure that we don't manage to control, lack of social support or relationships that from which we cannot escape, but they are also not satisfactory or difficult or abusive. Every situation really which are both inescapable, or at least we feel that we cannot escape, and that are challenging, that they are putting pressure on us and make us either suffer or feel uncomfortable, and we cannot change. That's how basically we interpret things as stressful.
Right. So I guess so. This maybe goes back to what you were saying before about the stress response being like the differences in the stress response being quantitative rather than qualitative. So would I be right in thinking then, just from that description of these kind of long-term stresses that we have in modern life that just sort of buzz away in the background like a fridge, are they still activating that same fight or flight response, but just at a much lower level?
Yes. So the panic attack, which is, could either be driven by an encounter with something which is we call a phobia. So something for which an individual person is particularly scared, but it can also be triggered spontaneously when we are stressed. So if we're going through a very difficult period, perhaps lots of work, lots of deadline that we don't manage to, pressure of work that we don't manage to handle, unsupported in emotional environment, we do have situations where our sympathetic system just fires spontaneously. And that's what we perceive as a panic attack. So some people have a more chronic, mild activation. And this is what we call kind of a general feeling of anxiety or anxiety disorder, where we have both at a mental level, we feel worried, we feel concerned, we feel on edge. And physically, we also usually feel tense, we feel uncomfortable, sometimes our heart beats too fast. But we also, on top of this, we also could have panic attack when really you have a release of sympathetic activity, which is almost the same as the one that you have in front of a predator. So it's the same mechanism that can operate chronically in a mild way, but also spontaneously, almost with the same intensity of a real scare. And that's why they call panic. That's why the person who experienced a panic attack feels as if he or she are in a real situation of danger, because the body responds as if there was a real danger.
Right. So I guess the first mistake one might make in the way we've been discussing the stress response so far is that it's a bit like a light switch. So the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system is either switched on or off. If one's on, the other one's off. But this sounds a bit, especially with the idea, the concept of anxiety. Correct me if this analogy isn't quite right, but instead of think of taps, a couple of taps in a bath or a sink, hot and cold, and it's almost like if the hot was on, then the cold has to be off. But what we're saying, it sounds like now, is that the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system can both be switched on at the same time, but at different levels, so that we can have a stress response that, say let's pick a concrete example. So say you've had a bailiff's letter drop through the letterbox, and tell you that you owe this much money by a certain date, or we're coming taking all your stuff, say the letter's giving you 2 months, is it then possible that your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, is then going to be switched on at a low level consistently for the next 2 months?
I mean, what is going to happen rather than switch on constantly is that you will just slightly be more reactive to normal condition, and sometimes it will just spontaneously fire. So probably what is going to happen is that the first time you see the letter, you will feel scared and tachycardic, and you will have dry mouth and unable to speak and really feel scared. Then that, you will calm down after an hour or so once you've tried to think about your alternative and what you can do. But then maybe the next day your thoughts goes back to the letter, maybe because you think about it or you see the letter, and that will trigger another reaction. Maybe not as strong as the one when you first opened the letter, but certainly something you feel. And then maybe the next day, out of the blue, you will have another reaction, because the threats of the bailiff is still always in the back of your mind.
Right. Okay. So then the switch analogy is accurate then. It's a switching on and a switching off.
Yes, but I mean, I think the tap perhaps is a little bit better, because you can, the tap can be on a little bit, as in just a drip and drip and drip. Then you can open it a lot. Then maybe you close it, and then you open it a little bit again. I think it's more valuable than just on and off. But also it's not always on. So it's a variability, so that you have a little bit of activity, more activity, a lot of activity, no activity, and it's quite unpredictable in terms that it goes with cues that you have from the environment. It could be triggered by the memory, it could be triggered by something else. So, for example, you're scared, you're worried about the bailiff, and you have a fight with your partner. You react to that fight worse because your underlying level of arousal is already activated. So the tap is there and is just simply doing more stuff. It's kind of on and off, on a little bit, off a little bit, then on a lot, in a more unpredictable way.
Right. Okay. Right. Before we go any further, I think it'd be good to kind of summarize everything we've kind of spoke about so far. And I think the best way to do that is to kind of give a concrete example of what's going on and kind of tie everything together. So I'm going to try and give an example now of everything you've just told us. And then at the end of it, you can tell me if that's kind of a good enough basic definition of what's happening in the body with a stress response. So, okay, let's imagine caveman. You're a caveman, you're sitting down, eating on the savannah, you're chilled out, relaxed, nice little Stone Age barbecue, maybe having a, I don't know, hairy mammoth burger or something. So your parasympathetic nervous system is activated, so the blood flow in your body is directed towards your digestive system, nice slow heartbeat, your muscles are relaxed. But then there's a rustle in the long grass on the savannah. So the amygdala activates, causes the startle response, alerting us to possible danger. On red alert, you jump to your feet, scan the environment, and that's the cortex, that's the you part of the brain, analysing the environment, trying to, say, pinpoint exactly where the lion is. Off there in the distance, you spot the lion crouching in the grass. Hippocampus activates the sympathetic nervous system. You get that sinking feeling in the chest. That's your body redirecting blood flow away from the digestive system towards the heart, the lungs, the muscles. So that's your heart starts beating, your breathing deepens. Meanwhile, so your hippocampus is doing two things. The other thing it's doing is it's sending a signal to your hypothalamus, which activates the pituitary gland, I think, which you've also been referring to as the hypophysis. Hypophysis?
Correct.
Yes.
Hypophysis, yes.
So this releases activating hormone into the blood, activating hormones into the bloodstream. And when these hormones reach your adrenal glands, which are located on top of your kidneys, it dumps a load of adrenaline into your bloodstream, and cortisol begins to be slowly released as well. So then the lion starts trotting towards you. You turn and leg it, but because your muscles are already primed, full of blood and adrenaline, you're like Usain Bolt. So you escape the lion by running up a steep rock face. The lion's down at the bottom. There's no way to go but up. You can't climb down because he's going to have you. So you've got to just climb. And that's where the cortisol in your system helps fuel this kind of prolonged getaway adventure. You reach the top of the rock face, find a lovely, flat, safe plateau, roll over, relax, danger averted. Safe from the lion, your sympathetic nervous system deactivates, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks back in and helps you begin digesting the mammoth burger you were eating before all the chaos started, and to help refuel your body from all the energy you've just expended. So is that, I know it's very long, but is that a good enough definition for the average Joe on the street to understand the stress response in an immediate context?
It is, Danny. You've done an absolutely fabulous job. And
Go on, but...
No buts.
No buts. Great.
No. I mean, there's very small things. The amygdala can actually activate the sympathetic nervous system directly, and the hippocampus is the one that plays with the pituitary gland. But that's a minimal thing. And of course, once you relax, the parasympathetic system kicks in, and also the cortisol levels slowly go back to normal.
Yes.
So everything is kind of, within an hour, you should be back to, the time. Within an hour of that, you're no longer in danger. You basically, your body is basically back to where it was before. Right.
Okay. So I did all right there. Not bad.
You did very well. You did very well.
Right. Okay. So, right. So we're jumping forward now, and we spoke a little bit about the kind of the links, the similarities between stress and anxiety. So, I do think there's a couple of questions worth sticking on with anxiety. The first one is, as we've kind of explained it so far, it sounds like the same hormones that are released in a stress response are the same hormones that are released and active in anxiety. So I'm just wondering what the difference is. What's the qualitative difference? Because we spoke about the quantitative difference in the stress response, but I'm wondering what the qualitative difference is between stress and anxiety.
Well, so there are two main differences. The most important one is obviously anxiety is triggered in the absence of a clear, in most cases, the anxiety is triggered in the absence of a real objective stress that would justify the reaction. So in panic disorders, people experience the same feeling of panic and terror that they would if they were in a life-threatening situation. But most often, this event comes out spontaneously with no immediately understandable causes, and there are probably spontaneous firing, if you like, of the stress response, which signal the fact that someone is under stress, but more as a kind of chronic stress. So it may just go through a very difficult time. People may just go through a very difficult time in their life, and once or twice or three times a day over subsequent days, their stress system just gets activated out of the blue. So this lack of correlation between the intensity of the response and the real objective danger is probably the clear differences between a normal, understandable stress response and anxiety. Now, in more chronic disorders, like what we call generalized anxiety disorders, where the focus is much more on a constant state of arousal, with constant rumination or preoccupation or concerns about the present or the future. Again, usually there's a cognitive, there's a thinking which interprets the environment with a more stressful view that the environment actually is. So people may be particularly worried about their health or their physical health or the risk of dying or their future at work. And they may just feel generally under threat, as if something bad may happen to them any moment. But again, this is usually not proportional to the reality of the situation. So it's this mismatch between the real dangers and the way our body and our mind react to it, which probably generate anxiety.
I guess I'm trying to think of a simple way of kind of differentiating between the two, and it almost sounds that with stress, maybe you're focused externally on an objective threat, whereas with anxiety, it's got to the point where your attention's turned inward, and it's focused on more subjective threat. There's just maybe the threat of your own thoughts, and is that a good differentiation? Or
yeah, absolutely. The anxiety comes from much more from inside. It is related to the outside as well, because obviously it's usually a combination of a real situation of distress or difficulties in life, but it's also the interpretation of that difficulties.
Yeah, it's just because I mean, as far as I know, stress isn't really classed as a mental health issue, is it? Whereas anxiety is, and it just seems that that's possibly a good way of differentiating between the two. Stress isn't necessarily a mental health issue, because if you're more focused on external factors and things that are maybe actually happening, whereas with anxiety, it's your attention, it's a self-focused attention that's turned inwards, and you're worrying about imaginary scenarios. And
these are probably the kind of the easiest black and white description of both. In reality, in most cases, it's a gray area. So if you've just heard that you have you or someone dear to you has a severe illness, a threatening illness, it's perfectly normal to feel anxious about it. Now, some people may feel more anxious because they charge it with a lot of emotions. Some people may be more prepared for the future and be more fatalistic and learn how not to worry until they know exactly what's going on. Each of us has a different way of coping with bad news and bad situation. So it's never like people having anxiety completely out of the blue when everything else is going really well, but it's also never perfectly understandable. But there's always a threatening, distressing situation, either at present or in the past, which had made that person more sensitive. And so it's this gray area combination of how much the objective situation is in fact difficult, and how much the individual person from the inside interpret and respond to that situation. And it's never black and white.
Another one, just quickly, is because we're talking about these kind of external factors and the cognitive aspect of it. So whether it's subjective, objective, whether it's real or imagined, the process starts in the mind. Whereas I've read speculation somewhere that anxiety is actually a dysfunction of the endocrine system, that it's the hormones are elevated. There's something wrong with that's almost similar to the chemical imbalance idea with depression, I guess, but at a hormonal level, that there's an imbalance there, that there's the adrenal glands are maybe just releasing these hormones into the system, which create a feeling of anxiety, which then fuels the cognitive processes. So it's the hormonal imbalance is at the start of the process, and the cognitive aspect is at the end of the process. Is there any truth in that?
I mean, you're right. There have been interpretation that tends to focus more on the body as the primary source of the signal and versus the brain. I mean, I think it's such a kind of connected system that is impossible to disentangle, because you know, it's not like you have a cancer in the adrenal that somehow starts shooting things out with no control. Is usually even if you do have an hyperactive peripheral stress system, so if your adrenal gland, your sympathetic system tend to shoot spontaneously more often or more intensely than in other people, it still comes out of perhaps a previous history of life stress that has made the stress response system more hyperactive. So it is always mediated through the brain, and I think it's very impossible. It's really impossible to disentangle. I mean, what's happening is probably is a is a kind of feed forward mechanism, so that the periphery may get activated and originate a signal. I mean, again, with the panic attack, it's particularly clear. You have a sudden feeling of, your heart sinking, you cannot breathe, your heart starts beating really, really fast, you feel like you're fainting, you feel dizzy, you feel that you need to sit down because otherwise you're gonna, drop dead. And these are physical sensations which at the same time your brain perceives, and obviously you feel scared because of this physical sensation, make you feel that you may be in danger, you may be unwell. And then the feeling scared further push forward the stress activation. So in this sense, it is it's a circular mechanism which feed forward each other.
Yeah, so it's like it snowballs, doesn't it? I mean, I can testify to this.
Snowball, exactly.
I guess, okay, just quickly, because I really want to get onto the link with depression, which I think is the more interesting link with stress.
Sorry, can I just add one more point, I think, that I wanted to add? Even in panic attacks, although they usually perceived subjectively as out of the blue and almost, impossible to explain, we know that in most cases, if you ask the person, there is usually something going on in their life at that time. Maybe not in that specific moment, but in that time, in those days or weeks that panic attacks either arrives, they starts, or they exacerbates. And they're usually problem with perceived or threat of loss. So, problem in a relationship, a problem with health, a problem with work. So, people do have, there is usually a real situation of concern. The panic is only one way of reacting to that, but it's usually understandable in the context of the events in the life of an individual at that time. And also, most of the time, not often, not always, but most of the time, you can think about the person. If you talk to the person long enough, the person can recognize something which could have triggered the individual panic attack. So, for example, the person could have been thinking about that particular concern at that time, or he or she could have been received some kind of, it could have had a memory, or could have seen or heard something which pushed the problem back into their mind. So we talk about panic attack as if they were not understandable or unjustifiable, but in reality, we can definitely understand why that person go through a period of panic attack in their life at that moment, and sometimes even what is the why at that moment in the day. So you just need time to talk to someone so that the person can connect the dots and understand, oh yes, actually I was very worried about this on that day because this thing happened, and really 20 minutes before the panic attack started, these things happened to me, or I remember this. It takes a little bit of time to think through.
Okay. Yeah, this one, just before moving on, it's a question that's commonly kind of posed in anxiety forums and the like, is about the physical symptoms of anxiety. And I was just wondering if it was these, because we were talking about this kind of shift, this hormonal shift and this shift of blood flow that takes place in the body during the stress response. Is it those hormonal changes which account for a lot of those symptoms related to anxiety, you know, like dizziness, nausea, depersonalization, people complain about aches and pains, lumps in the throat, etc. Is it the stress response that's causing those? And if so, do we know precisely how or why that's the case?
Well, certainly most of the symptoms that we feel in the body, so dizziness, nausea, aches and pains, lump in the throat, they all coming from mostly from the sympathetic activation, so the kind of real fast initial stress response. Why people feel depersonalization and derealization is less clear. It is definitely something which is activated by in situation of high arousal. So again, it is driven by activation of the sympathetic nervous systems. So most of the symptoms are largely driven by activation of the sympathetic nervous systems. We don't know exactly how, but there's definitely an effect.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to kind of give it a token mention because I think obviously somatic symptoms kind of deserve an episode of their own. But just that, I just think it's reassuring as someone with anxiety to just know that you can account for those symptoms based on those hormonal changes, rather than just thinking that you're just going insane and there's just crazy things happening to your body, or that maybe it's purely your imagination, that there's nothing going on in your body and you're just imagining it. I just think it's quite reassuring to know that there's a physiological basis for those symptoms. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's not only hormones. So for example, we know that during acute stress, inflammation goes up as well. And inflammation, as we all know, when we have a high fever, because we get a bad flu, inflammation also makes us feel tired, grumpy. It reduces our appetite. It makes our sleep worse. So all of these symptoms are, the range of symptoms are all understandable once you put together all the different changes in the body. And certainly people who suffer from anxiety disorder or panic attack or any forms of anxiety disorder should never think that they're imagining it. That it's not their brain that's playing trick. It's their body is actually really firing away when they're feeling like this. And there's a real reason why they have all these somatic symptoms. The misperception is the fact that the environment around may not justify the level of alarm, but the alarm in the body is there, as if the lion was there.
Right. So I want to. This is kind of all what we've been building up to now. So when this stress response becomes chronic, we're talking about actual physiological damage taking place. And like I said, we're focusing specifically on above the neck, the damage and the damage and neurological changes that take place in the brain, and how stress is linked to depression. I'm not really sure how to kind of fire off with this one. I guess a good starting question would be, when stress becomes chronic, what kind of damage is what's happening? What changes from it just being purely that kind of the stress response that causes hyperarousal to where it's really starting to take a physiological toll? What's going on there?
So the main things is that obviously you start seeing effect on the body and on the brain that are due to the persistently activated stress systems. So for example, if you have a constant state of even mild hyperarousal with your sympathetic systems just slightly always activated, you start having problems like high blood pressure or tachycardia or kind of fast heart beating. The high level of glucocorticoids, again, if they're present continuously, they can reduce the health of brain cells. So they make the connection between the brain cells not as effective as before. In physically, in the rest of the body, if you have a high level of glucocorticoids, you have, for example, a predisposition to put on weight, to develop more metabolic difficulties. So, to control your sugar in the body, or the fat in your body, and so on. So these systems, which are supposed to really activate and deactivate very quickly, once they become chronically activated, they do start having a toll. And one of the consequences of brain cells not communicating effectively is that our stress systems actually becomes even more hyperactive and more hyper-responsive. So again, we have a situation of a vicious cycle that perpetuates or makes the risk of depression in the future worse and worse. So let me give you an example. There are new brain cells that are formed actually in the hippocampus, even in adults. I mean, most brain cells forms during development when we are in utero, when we are growing in our mom's tummy. But there's a small amount of new neurons, of new brain cells that are constantly formed even in adult life.
Sorry, Carmina, this is the process of neurogenesis.
Exactly. This is the process that we call neurogenesis. Now, the cells that are localized, the new cells that are localized in the hippocampus, so the cells that are born in the hippocampus, have important function in terms of our ability to understand the environment and also to keep our stress system under control. So in other words, these are cells that, by connecting the hippocampus to other brain structure leading to the hypothalamus, keep the stress response more healthy and stable. So if you have high level of glucocorticoids constantly because you are feeling depressed or because you had a prolonged period of stress, those cells in the brain start to suffer, which makes our stress system even more responsive, which means the next time we have another life event which is difficult, our glucocorticoid level go up even further, which then affect the brain cells even more, and so on and so on. So that's the problem why, or this is one of the mechanisms we think explains why usually depression, for people that have recurrent depression, so they have more than 2 or 3 episodes in their life, really with time it becomes worse and worse and worse, because every time there's an additional toll on the brain, which makes us more susceptible to become again depressed next time we have another life event happening to us.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, so when you're struggling with depression, your brain is sending an elevated stress signal to the body, but it's also becoming less effective in shutting down glucocorticoid secretion. Glucocorticoids being adrenaline and cortisol.
Yeah, cortisol, yeah.
And with that elevation of glucocorticoid secretion, it's causing more damage to the brain, which sends an even higher stress signal to the body, and then gets even less effective shutting down the secretion.
Exactly. That's exactly correct.
Now, with one of the things I came across in doing a bit of research was we're just saying then that raised glucocorticoid levels inhibit neurogenesis, the creation of new brain cells, which leads to a reduced volume in the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. What are the consequences precisely of that? Because I mean, if you could take us, obviously, you could take us back to what the hippocampus and the frontal cortex does, and then we can probably derive from that exactly what the effects are going to be.
So there's two main function of neurogenesis in the hippocampus. One is, as we've just discussed, to keep a healthy response to stress. So a response to stress that go up when needed, but also goes down quickly when it's not needed anymore. So that's one aspect which is disrupted if the high level of glucocorticoids inhibits neurogenesis and does not allow for enough new brain cells to be born. The other function of neurogenesis is really to kind of help cognitively to interpret the environment. And in particular, neurogenesis helps in what is called pattern recognition. In other words, in our ability to separate, to distinguish two situations as separate and different. So let me give you an example, which is particularly appropriate for depression or anxiety. So we may have had a previous life experience where we have been under duress or bullied or stressed, and we may have interpreted that as showing that the world is against us and the world is not a very safe place, which is perfectly understandable in the context of that experience. And then, a few years later, we are in a different situation where perhaps our work environment is not as, we feel unsafe in our work environment, but by no means is the situation is as severe or as threatening as when we were bullied. Yet we put the two and two situations together. We recognize cues in the second situation that make us interpret that situation as threatening, dangerous, and representing a hostile world against us. So in this way, we do what we call generalization. We generalize what we learn from one situation to many other situations only because the other situation give us cues, but actually, even if they're not as bad as the real bad situation that we had in the past. Now, neurogenesis, by forming new brain cells, teach us or allow us to separate situations, to distinguish one situation from the other, so that we don't always respond to situations in the same way, as if every situation always confirm something negative about the world. It allows us to distinguish, this is a new situation, is different from before. But if we don't have neurogenesis, or if it's not as effective, then we tend to generalize more. We use old pattern, we apply old pattern into new situation. And obviously these are usually negative old pattern, which means the world is always more threatening and negative than it really is. So you can see how neurogenesis is really crucial, both from the point of view of our body functioning properly, our stress response functioning properly, but also our mind and a way that we appraise the environment around us functioning properly. So if you have a situation of high glucocorticoids on a constant level, let's say because you have been depressed on one or two occasions, and then your neurogenesis is reduced, well, every time there is a situation which even only hints of being negative, we will react as if it is really negative. And plus our stress response will biologically be even more acutely activated. And so even our body symptoms will be even worse. So it's really, unfortunately, it is recipe for disaster, if you know what I mean.
Is there any direct effects that glucocorticoids have on serotonin, dopamine, and all those chemicals that are linked to depression?
They do. It's largely to having an effect though on the whole brain cells rather than because they affect the way the brain cells work, and the brain cells are connected, and dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline in the brain are the main neurotransmitters that the cells are connected with. Of course, they are affected, but there are also other substances are affected, which allows us to communicate. But we know, for example, that if you have high level of glucocorticoids, your dopamine level or your dopamine activity in the brain goes up, which is probably why for some people who are predisposed to developing psychotic illnesses, so let's say schizophrenia or particularly severe bipolar disorder, stress can precipitate these episodes, probably because it starts a very strong dopamine reaction in the brain.
Is this damage to the brain cells, is this linked to kind of what you touched upon a moment ago, this idea of inflammation? Because I've read that people with depression are often mildly immunosuppressed. So I'm guessing that with the immune function inhibited, that's what causes or facilitates inflammation. And is it the inflammation that's kind of maybe, I don't know, kind of eating away at the brain cells?
Well, yes, you're definitely right. I mean, we know. So there was an old idea in the past that depressed patients were immunosuppressed. But actually what we now know is that if anything, depressed patients are hyperactive. Their immune system is hyperactive. And the hyperactive immune system also contributes to reducing neurogenesis. So in fact, we have done research on this. And both glucocorticoids and inflammation, they both reduce neurogenesis. So when you're depressed, you really have a perfect hormonal storm to reduce the neurogenesis in the brain. And probably more than one mechanism is operating at the same time. But definitely the high glucocorticoids and the high inflammation are the two that are the one that we know most or more about it. The other things I want to say, because obviously I'm giving you this really kind of negative outlook as if once you're depressed, you're doomed and your brain is only going to get worse. But we also know that these changes can be reversed. And, there's always a lot of controversies about what antidepressants do. Do they really have an effect on the brain? Do they normalize a chemical imbalance? And by the way, chemical imbalance is not something we say anymore in the scientific community. It's really just a very simple model that has been used for many years.
Still a popular public idea, though.
It's a popular idea, I know, and it's probably now. I think it's an idea that was helpful was based on what we knew in the 80s, and it was helpful at that time. It's just very difficult to change some language once it becomes part of normal, conversation. However, there's one thing we do know that antidepressants really do, and that is increasing neurogenesis. And it's interesting because antidepressants increase neurogenesis only if you are stressed or depressed. Obviously, these are experimental models, although there's a little bit of data in humans as well, largely from what we call postmortem studies. So people that donated their brains before dying, they've donated their brains for research. But if you look all the data from experimental studies, if you create a situation of stress, you reduce neurogenesis. If you give antidepressant, you normalize neurogenesis.
So I guess that's that what antidepressants are doing then is, rather than correcting a chemical imbalance, if they're facilitating neurogenesis, then they're also facilitating the patient getting, new ways of seeing the world. Instead of being kind of locked in that vicious cycle, they're able to develop new ways of looking at the world, new ways of thinking about their situation. Is that correct? Absolutely correct.
And there's two interesting points. First of all, there's been a lot of research, for example, done by in Oxford by my colleague Kath Harmer, demonstrating that if you give antidepressant to patient, even very early in the treatment, only after a few days, their way of seeing the world changes. If you test with cognitive tests and using imaging of the brain, how a depressed patient responds to the world or to the environment, the response changed very quickly. So this is definitely an effect of antidepressant, allows patient to look at the world in a different way, and it's one of the first things that happens actually. And the other important point is that obviously this is also what psychotherapy does. So psychotherapy and antidepressants should not be seen as one against the other. They're probably just different way of tapping into the same mechanism and eventually leading to the same effect. Of course, these are different processes. In one, there is a medication. In another one, there is an intense and prolonged psychological work that you do with, usually with a therapist or someone that guides you. But they're probably just different way of tapping into the same brain mechanism in obtaining the same effect. And that's why together, antidepressant and psychotherapy are always better than one of them alone.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like using the two in conjunction with one another would probably be the best approach, because I don't know, I'm wondering if maybe that accounts for why a lot of people don't find success with antidepressants, because if you just kind of take a pill and then just continue to sit at home and not really try to develop any kind of new ideas, maybe could go some way to explaining why some people find antidepressants unsuccessful. I don't know, maybe that's probably a whole nother conversation. What I'd kind of like to finish up with, though, a couple of interesting things is, well, actually on this one, when you were saying we were kind of getting into a bit of a pessimistic message, making it sound like people were doomed once this stress response had kicked in and become chronic, then you were kind of goosed. I have to say, I did read somewhere that when the stress response is directly linked with major depression, apparently after 3 to 4 cycles of major depression, the link between stress and depression uncouples, and then the depression takes on an internal rhythm of its own that's independent of outside stressors. I read that was by Robert Sapolsky. I'm wondering if you've got any kind of elaboration on that, because that does sound a pretty damning verdict. Yes. Like if you don't get on top of it soon enough, then maybe it is. Maybe you are doomed. I don't know. What's your take on that?
So you certainly become more vulnerable, so that you require, if you like, less stress from the outside to become depressed again. One of the problem with the problem with long-term chronic depression is that very rarely happens in a vacuum of a perfect happy life. Is usually a combination of someone becoming more vulnerable to depression, potentially because more episodes have occurred, but also some aspect of the life of an individual that perhaps are not as satisfactory or as rewarding as that person wishes to be. And, it's nobody's fault. I mean, some people just simply perhaps they're not in the relationship that they wish they would, or they may not have a relationship, but they wish they had one, or they may not be in the job that they wish they had. They may suffer from real social discrimination. Imagine people that are, coming from a different country, the political refugees or asylum seekers running away from wars. So in other words, there are situations where there may be not a single, a dramatic event that precipitates an episode of depression, for that person may be enough just the ongoing continuous problem, which has a toll. And so that person never managed to either recover fully, or even if he's recovered fully, then the depression kicks in again. So it's always a combination. I'm always trying to go back to this idea of it's not black and white. There is always a combination of vulnerability in an environment and the vulnerability gets worse, and the environment is perhaps not as good as one wish anyway, and the two things together makes the depression worse over time. But again, I really want to put across the message that people are not doomed, and people should seek help, regardless of what, all the controversies in the media. If you look at the studies, antidepressants do work. Even when compared with dummy pills, the antidepressant do work very well. And, I want to say this really emphatically. If you look at all the data from the control studies where antidepressants are compared with dummy pills, if you just look at the measurement of sadness and low mood, more than 90% of all studies that have ever been conducted with antidepressants compared to a dummy pill show that antidepressants are better than dummy pill in lifting the mood and reducing the sadness. So the noise out there, the controversies out there, is not representative of the real strengths of this medication. Now, they do have side effects, and these are important. As you said, this may be a different conversation, but they do, antidepressant, like all the other medication, have side effects, which needs to be monitored. The medication that needs to be taken under supervision of a doctor, but they do work. And they do work even more if a person is supported through psychological help. So these are not antithetic models. These are, they're converging help from psychiatry and psychology to help people with depression. And yes, some people have chronic depression, some people don't respond to the antidepressant that we have, but most people do respond. And the fact that some people don't respond should actually push us forward in developing new and better antidepressants and new and better psychotherapies for the people that are not helped at the moment. But we shouldn't detract from the success that we already have. I also want to emphasize again, there's a lot of controversies on antidepressants. There's a lot of perception as if antidepressants are sold because, pharmaceutical companies are putting a lot of pressure on doctors or on public opinion. Actually, most of the antidepressants prescribed today are off patent, which means they're very cheap and pharmaceutical companies don't make any money out of it. Yes, it's true in the past, especially in the 80s, in the 90s, pharmaceutical companies have benefited from developing antidepressants. I mean, that's what pharmaceutical companies do. They develop medications. But at the moment, in general, a lot of the research on antidepressants has been conducted by independent organizations, including, for example, the Medical Research Council, which is fully funded by the UK government, and equivalent research councils in other countries like in the US. A lot of research on antidepressants has been conducted independently, and yet we always have the same message: the antidepressants do work.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be getting a dedicated episode at some point. The whole medication thing, the pharmaceutical industry. Bear with me, listeners. I will be going down all these rabbit holes at some point. What I wanted to close up with was, I thought, quite an interesting statistic, is that apparently only about half of people with clinical depression have elevated glucocorticoid levels. And of course, the whole premise of this episode is that link between stress and depression. So how do we account for that, if that's a true statistic, of course?
So actually, you really nail it as one of the questions that people like myself and other colleagues in this field are trying to understand. And there are two answers which are not mutually exclusive. It gives just a way of looking at the complexity of this. So first of all, we think that biologically not all depressed patients are the same. Imagine depression almost like fever. Depression is changes in behavior and in emotions, which are representative of of processes that are going on in the brain and in the body, like fever signals there's something going on in the brain and in the body. But for example, you can have fever if you have cancer, you can have fever if you have an autoimmune disease, you can have fever if you have a viral infection, you can have fever if you have a bacterial infection. So someone walks into your door with fever, they look the same if you measure fever, but the actual mechanism behind could be completely different. And we think depression is very similar, that the symptoms and the signs, so what patient reveals to us may be very similar across different individuals, but actually the biology of the depression in each individual may be different. So it is possible that the high glucocorticoids or the high inflammation depression is only one subgroup. Half of the patient, a third of the patient, we don't really know. A large subgroup, a subgroup. And there are different pathways from which people arrive to depression, different clinical pathway and different biological pathway. And the depression with high level of glucocorticoids and high level of inflammation seems to be largely a depression which originates almost in a lifelong of an individual. So the people that have depression in the context of high level of glucocorticoids and high level of inflammation are people that perhaps had a very difficult childhood, were exposed to life stressors early in their life, separation from parents, bullying, violence early in their life, and then perhaps develop a vulnerability. And when they become young adult or adult, something has happened in their life, perhaps a loss, a bereavement, or a change in social circumstances, and they become depressed. So there is a cluster of symptoms and biological abnormalities that tell us that high glucocorticoids and high inflammation talks about a depression which is built over years and years in the life of an individual. Another person who perhaps becomes depressed, even if someone who had a very regular and healthy life, and then once he turns 30 or 35 or 40, something bad happened to him or her, and they become depressed, could be completely different from the other story that I've mentioned before. So I think this idea that we have different type, biologically we have different type of depression, which resemble different type of pathway to depression, I think is quite important. And of course, some people have genetic predisposition, so they may have had depression in their parents and their grandparents, and some people don't. And again, this will bring a different biology to it. So I think it just shows that there is not one kind of depression. Now, the second, but again, complementary explanation is that we still don't have the tools to measure everything we need to measure about, let's say, glucocorticoids or inflammation. So that we may be looking at one molecule, let's say cortisol, and okay, 50% of depressed patients, the cortisol is normal, but perhaps other aspect of what cortisol does is not normal anyway. So I think it's a combination of, yes, there is a diversity from a biological point of view within depression, and perhaps we still don't have the right tool to really dissect the mechanism in the body.
Right, okay. God, it's it's complicated.
It's complicated, and I am prolix. I know I talk a lot.
No, I'm just thinking, I'm not sure whether this kind of, the simplified idea of depression, which I think the public perception of depression is still, there's just a chemical imbalance that either you're born with or that just kind of springs up out of the blue one day. And it's a very unhelpful explanation on the one hand, but then the depth of the truth behind the matter, all these different variables, that's difficult for somebody to grasp in the first place. There's no way of kind of summarizing this in a nice pithy way that can help the public understand it. So yeah, it's interesting, but I don't know how it's how we're going to get that message of complication out there to help people better understand exactly what's going on.
Danny, I think that as a psychiatrist, we like to, we put people together. We think about depressed people as a group, and this is something that we have to, so that we can create guidelines for treatment, or to do, for example, investigation on the biology of depression. But we also, as a psychiatrist, as a clinician psychiatrist, we also look at the individual patient. And I really don't think that a depression coming out of the blue, creating a chemical imbalance out of the blue, is representative of anybody experience. And I totally agree with you. It's misleading and unhelpful. The reality is that we have, millions of individuals, each with their own stories. And the story is usually a combination of vulnerability, some genetic, the things that the genes that we get from our parents. Some is vulnerability that is built early in our life through the experience in childhood. And then there's a story of events happening to us. And of course, we all have bad things happening to us. And most of the time, people react with sadness and to loss, and we feel distressed, and we have periods in our life that we don't function well. And that's perfectly normal. And I think we should always remember that this is a perfectly normal experience, and we don't want to medicalize human distress. And some people, because of the vulnerability, or because the environment is so severe, and a combination of both, they just don't manage to react spontaneously, or they don't manage to react spontaneously quickly enough. And so, someone becomes depressed, even in a situation that we all understand, like following the loss of a son or a partner. But yet, if this then brings on unemployment because the person is not able to go to work, if it brings on physical illness because the person stops eating or drinking, or even if it brings on death because a person contemplates to take their own life by suicide, well, that's, I think, is when the threshold between normal distressing reaction and a disorder that requires intervention, that's where the threshold is passed.
Well, I think before we get on into the final furlong, I think it'd be nice if we could. Prevention's better than cure, as they say. So let's imagine someone's in the thick of a stressful situation. They're a couple of months in and things are really getting on top of them, but they've not got to the point where full-blown anxiety or depression is kicked in. We don't need to go into too much detail here, but just kind of a brief summary. What are the best methods of alleviating the stress response that are kind of immediately available to most people?
So the key answer is take care of yourself. Do the things that will make you feel better. I think some are good for everybody. Physical exercise and time spent outside, walk in the parks, contemplating beauties, through, even if it's just the flowers and the trees. Have a good, healthy diet, fruit, vegetable, fish and fish oil supplement, which actually they do really help with stress. And spend time with your friends. Make sure you're never alone. Don't feel that you cannot share things with the people around you. Really mobilize the people that you have next to you, your closer friends, your closer relatives. Talk to them about your problems. We underestimate how important it is to talk to someone about our problems. It's not only because we share and we ventilate we in a way we expel them from our brain by talking about it, but we also reason about it. And sometimes by talking to someone, we can find a solution, or we can see things differently, or in a clearer way. Plus, talking with someone makes us feel warmth inside, makes us feel connected with someone real, which is really important for mental health. And do all the other things that you in particular like. If you like to go to see a movies, go to see a movies, read a book. Do the little things that make you happy and you think they're not important, because somehow one of the consequences of being under stress is that you feel that you're no longer important, that the problems takes over your life. And so you need to assert yourself back against the problem and say, actually, I do have to find the time for my walk in the park. I do have to find the time to read the book. I do have to find the time to eat properly. I do have to find the time to take care of myself. And I do have to find the time to see my friends. This is the key protective factors.
Yeah, putting yourself first.
Yes.
What do you think, just quickly, what do you think about the evidence for things like mindfulness and meditation that are kind of part of the cultural zeitgeist at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, they help. They absolutely help. They are stress relaxing techniques. Again, I think some people are better than others in mindfulness and in meditation. Some people really engage and they feel relaxed and they enjoy it. But I don't want people feel that they have to be able to be mindful and they have to be able to meditate. For some people, they can reach the same level of calm by walking in a park, for example, by doing a long walk or by relaxing into a book. So it's about finding what's best for you.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's definitely a nice little way of putting it, is just put yourself first, make yourself the priority. Your job, your debts, your whatever, all that shit can wait, man. Honestly, I always say people, you don't want to, I was one of those people that tipped over the edge into losing my shit, and you don't want to join me down here. It's not fun down here. It's not worth it. So yeah, put yourself first. I didn't. Okay, Carmina, as with everybody, I'm going to subject you to my quick fire questions now. Starting with, do you have any book recommendations on this topic, or anything else you feel would be of value to the listeners?
I don't actually. No, I don't. There are good books out there on mental health. I think whatever people read, it should be from a reputable source. And they should read things that they can recognize coming from people who have clinical experience or potential research experience. The other things that books don't have to be books about stress and about psychology. A good novel could give you as much as insight in life and on life and on mental health and on emotions and behavior as any academic book. So read good novels are also good for mental health.
Have you got a favorite novel?
Well, at the moment, I'm really fond of Jonathan Franzen, who's really kind of really good American author that is wonderful in the way he depicts characters, but also describes all the social difficulties in Americas today. So yeah, Jonathan Franzen is not my friend. I don't get any money out of it. I just really like him.
Well, I think my recommendation would be, just to throw it out there, there's a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky, and I think that's a really good kind of layperson's introduction to stress, and there's a little bit in there about mental health, but it's all about really like the endocrine system and hormones, and yeah, I found that a really good book myself. So, okay. If you could have unlimited funding to research anything you liked, however niche or bizarre, what would it be and why?
It would be how antidepressants work. It would be putting more money into how antidepressants work and developing new antidepressants for the future. Because at the moment, even if we put together all the medication that we have, we still have about 25% of depressed patients that don't get better. And so and we have so many molecules, we have so many new mechanisms that we could look at. And so it would really be understanding, first of all, understanding how the current antidepressants truly work. I mean, I've said that the chemical imbalance is not really a valid model. We do know they do increase neurogenesis, but we still don't know the exact mechanism. And I think I would like to discover the exact mechanism and use that to develop better antidepressants.
Okay. If you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public? And I always say, think very dictatorially. You can do whatever you want. Benevolent dictator, of course.
Well, I think that mental health starts very, very early in pregnancy and the early year of life. I'm not the only one thinking that, of course. But as part of my research and as my direct clinical experience as a perinatal psychiatrist, I do see what a difficult pregnancy and difficult upbringing does on the offspring. So not only on the mother, but on the child when the child becomes an adolescent and a young adult. So I think, I would like the Department of Health to make a clear statement that actually every pregnant woman, and every pregnancy and every child is a responsibility of all of us. And we should really protect vulnerable pregnant women and vulnerable, mother and children and families when kids are young, because that's where we start creating resilience.
What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
I think it is unfortunately the usual suspect, poverty, lack of resources, the patients that I've seen on that day, and I know I cannot help completely because, there are no beds, there is a waiting time for mental health services, there's not enough availability of psychological help. They're poor and there's no resources to support them financially. It's really, it's really the distress of the people and the fact that they feel powerless on many occasions.
What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
Don't email when you're drunk.
Oh, I don't suppose you care to share a related anecdote, do you?
Luckily enough, it wasn't following something I did, but it was something that person did, and that's why he decided to share the wisdom with me. But yes, I totally recommend to all people not to email when you're drunk, and not to text either when you're drunk.
That's it. Save it in drafts until you've sobered up.
Absolutely.
What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
I really trust people, and I'm always prepared to give people a second, a third, and a fourth, and a fifth chance. And this, sometimes this fires back, either at an emotional level through friends or a professional level. Try to engage with colleagues that perhaps are difficult, and you hope that you can bring them along. So, I guess my mistakes is always trust that I can get close to people and brings people on my side. But I don't always manage to do it.
What part of your career are you most proud of?
Certainly the fact that I have been able to support the career of many, many young scientists, not only psychiatrists, but psychologists and biologists. And, even if I'm in early 50s, so I'm still quite early. I'm a consolidated academic, but I'm not, toward the end of my career yet. I can already see people who have done a PhD with me, and they were very young, already taking on academic posts in university worldwide. And just knowing that I'm creating a family, a family trees of young people, and that inspire them with enthusiasm for research and commitment to research and to improving the health of other people.
Oh, that's a great answer. Okay, final two. Outside of family and academia, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Well, over the last few years, I've dedicated more time to physical activity, both running and martial arts. I'm an active kung fu.
Oh wow!
Yes.
What belt are you?
Well, we don't have really belt in kung fu.
Okay.
I'm considered a kind of a senior student at the moment, and I think both. I felt really rewarded by that. I think that there's something about physical exercise, either, as a runner, but also as part of a team and learning every day or, 2 or 3 times a week. There's something so rewarding about seeing your body changing and your performance getting better, which, everyday life doesn't give you the same satisfaction. At work, I'm sure you and I are the same. We work very hard, and we're probably doing today the same things we've done yesterday, and we feel we've done more or less the same. But if you do more physical exercise, you run faster, you run longer, you can do your martial art exercise better. And I think, so that's really something which has really changed the way I've been able to kind of have rewards outside life, academia and family.
Okay. Finally, what do you think is the key to happiness?
Is definitely connection, a real connection with real people. So there's no happiness without being connected with other people. Being a partner, for those who are lucky enough to have a partner, good partner, but, friends, relatives, people that you meet through social opportunities. It is really about connection, and it should be real connection. It is one-to-one connection. It's talking in person, meeting in person, talking on the phone where you cannot meet in person, and I think, and I'm talking now in particular to the younger generation, which obviously focus so much of the energy in connection through social media, which of course is important for building a network and for knowing, the day-to-day events that happens to your friends. But the voice, the voice of someone, talking to someone, the physical contact, the physical presence, I think that's much more important, or that's essential. And I think that really makes you happy. You can be the most successful man in the world or woman in the world. If you don't have friends and people that you love and they love you, you're never going to be happy.
Definitely. Carmine, have you got any links you'd like to direct the listeners to? And if you're on social media as well?
I do. I have a Twitter account, and we have a Facebook page for our laboratory.
What's your Twitter handle?
Is Pariante Spy Lab. And if people put, Pariante in the Pariante KCL or Carmine Pariante in the Twitter search, it comes up. And the Facebook page is again KCL Spy Lab. Spy Lab is the name of my laboratory. The name stands for Stress, Psychiatry, and Immunology, but we really like Spy Lab. We felt it was really cool, kind of James Bond-like.
Yes. Well, I will include links in the show notes so people can find you there. And that's about it. Carmine Pariante, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a privilege to actually have the time to reason with someone so thoughtful and articulated, and ask me really good questions that made me think. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, for those of you who didn't enjoy this episode, You guys can bugger off and skip this bit because it doesn't apply to you. But if you did enjoy this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, there are a number of ways you can do so. You could blast out a little mention on social media saying, yeah, check this knobhead out, he's actually pretty good. You could like our Facebook page or leave us a review there, even better. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy on Facebook. I'm sure we'll pop up. You could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. It's always a nice way of encouraging new listeners to give us a whirl. Or, if you're feeling particularly generous and you feel that this podcast is genuinely adding some value and you'd like to support it in a more long-term sense, then you can become a subscriber for as little as £1 a month. Or you could just make a one-off donation, again, for as little as £1. So, yeah, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support. But only if you can afford it, and, no donations from stolen credit cards either, please. Can't be arsed with that hassle. So, yeah, plenty of things to keep you busy there while I go busy myself, putting the next episode together. So, in the meantime, as I always say, behave yourselves, but not too much, and I'll see you again next time.